So it's no secret that gay men struggle with intimacy and relationships. Many of us are perpetually single. We have a really hard time opening up, and we experience so much disappointment from other men that a lot of us adopt this cynical mentality of, I'm never going to find somebody, and so I may as well give up. And so I want to help us as a community to avoid that cynicism and hopelessness because really ultimately we're all looking for the same thing, and yet somehow we're not getting it. And so I think the first step towards getting what we want is understanding the problem. What is holding us back? Why is it so hard for us to find love and to maintain love? And sometimes I hear people say things like, well, that's just how the male brain is wired. We're meant to be wanderers, just spreading our seed. And really, there's no research to support that. Gay men crave intimacy and love just as much as everybody else. It really comes down to defenses. Because of how we were raised and what we went through, gay men have a lot of defenses that make vulnerability and intimacy very difficult. And so I want to spend 1 minute going through each one of those defenses, and then at the end I want to provide some tips for working through them. So the first level of defense to intimacy can actually be applied to both gay and straight males, and it arises from the standards of masculinity in our society. From a very young age, boys are expected, above all, to be strong, and that means being in control at all times, competitive, rational, and most importantly, unemotional. Boys are constantly shamed for being emotional. They're told not to cry, they're told to suck it up and get over it when they get hurt or upset, and so emotions, with the exception of anger, become associated with weakness and rejection, and those messages get really deeply instilled and make it really difficult for us to be vulnerable. And this problem is especially bad in the gay community because the other message that boys and men get is that the only place where they can be emotionally vulnerable is with women. And obviously, in a gay relationship, we don't have that sense of safety. And so oftentimes, both men feel this need to be strong and unemotional around each other because that's how they've always acted around men. And there can be this belief that if I share a really deeply vulnerable side of myself with my partner, I'll be perceived as weak, or he will shame me for it, or somehow use it against me. So the second level of defense for gay men arises from our very first relationships in life with our parents or caretakers. Usually gay boys start to act differently than their straight peers at a very young age, and unfortunately those differences are often met with resistance or rejection from our caretakers. For example, fathers often resist or reject their sons acting in traditionally feminine ways. And as painful as that is, we have to make sure that our parents accept us at that age because we literally depend on them for survival. And so many of us learn to hold back or to hide those parts of ourselves that put us at risk for rejection. And with that decision, a very important defensive pattern forms. We come to associate sharing our true, complete self with somebody with those painful feelings of rejection. On a basic level, dependency and vulnerability become sources of danger instead of safety. We come to live our lives thinking that we can only really depend on ourselves. And that pattern can last for a really long time. I constantly hear gay men say that they would rather be alone than risk being intimate with another man. And that belief can partially stem from that deeply held defensiveness we learned in our first relationships. So the third level of defense is the false self that most gay men create. Since we got consistent messages growing up that our authentic selves would not be accepted, many of us repress that self and we create a false self in its place that will be accepted. And usually it's the version of ourselves that our parents or people close to us wanted us to be. So straight, good in school, good athlete, well liked, whatever gave us the best chance of acceptance. And so we become very good at putting up a front and managing how people see us and fitting in while hiding what's really going on inside, which is usually a lot of pain. And as much as we might think that the moment we come out, the false self just dissolves and our authentic self takes over, that's not usually the case. We maintain the false self as defense, and we have a tendency to go back to it when difficult emotions come up or when we feel threatened. For example, if we get hurt by someone, often the false self emerges and says, I'm okay, I didn't care about that person anyway. The false self is a defense that allows us to avoid pain by pretending to be someone we're not. And of course, that makes intimacy very difficult because when we're putting up a front and pretending we're okay, we're not really letting people in and being vulnerable. So the fourth level of defense to consider is that many gay men don't have a lot of experience with intimacy. Since many of us were not out in our teenage years and often beyond, we didn't get those early dating experiences where you learn both the good and the hard parts of intimacy. For example, it takes experience with intimacy to know that you can get in a really bad fight with your partner and you don't have to run away and end the relationship. You can actually use that as an opportunity to deepen the relationship. And it's not just lack of experience, it's also lack of role models. Throughout our lives, we haven't had many positive role models for intimacy at all. It wasn't even legal to get married in this country until last year, and for the most part, gay men have been portrayed as sexual objects who are unfit for long-term relationships. And finally, we lost many of the people that could have been our positive role models today in the 80s and 90s due to AIDS. So, of course, you're going to be defended against something that you don't have experience in or a positive example to look up to. It's as if you never gave a speech in your life or never watched someone give a speech in your life and then suddenly you were thrust in front of 1,000 people. Often, gay men just need practice, and yet that practice is really hard to come by because so many of us are in the same defended, inexperienced position. So, as you can see, there's a lot of defenses that make intimacy very difficult for gay men. And of course, not all of these will apply to everyone, and there are many more unique defenses based on individual experience, but these are some of the basic ones that I see a lot. And because of these defenses, we get put in this bind, where we crave intimacy and love and connection, but what we crave is also a source of danger. And so, how do we get out of the bind? How do we form intimate relationships while being so defended? And I want to start with the wrong answer to that question. Because, like with anything, our first instinct is to look for fast and easy shortcuts, where we get the human connection and the good feelings that come along with that while avoiding our defenses and the negative emotions beneath them. And you see gay men taking these shortcuts all the time. For example, anonymous sex and drugs are two of those shortcuts, and they're big parts of our culture. You get the immediate human connection and the good feelings while bypassing defenses altogether. But of course, ultimately, as many gay men will attest, those shortcuts don't really get us what we want. They're more of a quick fix that is fleeting as opposed to a lasting feeling of love and connectedness. We can't just bypass defenses or pretend they don't exist. What we have to do instead is acknowledge them and consciously challenge them whenever possible. We have to recognize that our defenses are serving a purpose, after all, to protect us. And they do a really good job of protecting us, but often they overprotect us and leave us isolated. So we have to find a balance between protection and isolation. So when you feel a defense rising up telling you to run away from someone that's just hurt you, for example, acknowledge what's happening, you're protecting yourself, but don't let the defense sabotage the relationship. Choose instead to communicate honestly with the person about what's going on for you. You can let them in on the process. You can say, I'm having a reaction that's making me want to run away or shut down, but I'm choosing not to. Then instead of ending the relationship, it becomes an opportunity for deepening the relationship and communicating your wants and needs. So honor your defenses, but don't let them sabotage you. Protect yourself, but don't overprotect. Practice letting your guard down just a little bit longer and being vulnerable. Because when you do that, you open yourself up to the kinds of relationships that can heal the wounds at the root of your defenses.